a widow, 13 cents, and a man who already knew she was sitting on a fortune worth killing for. In the summer of 1883, Lydia Mercer walked into the only store in Caldwell Creek with everything she had left in this world, 13 copper cents and a hunger that had been gnawing at her ribs for 3 days straight. She wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't begging. She just wanted bread. What she got instead was a lesson in how power really works in a town where one man owns everything, including the people. But what Silas Crow didn't count on was the man standing in the shadows watching. And he never counted on what Lydia Mercer would become. This is her story. Stay until the end. Because justice, when it finally comes, is worth every brutal mile. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The summer of 1883 came to Caldwell Creek, Colorado, like a punishment nobody had earned but everyone was serving. By late July, the creek itself, the one the town had been named after, back when optimism still meant something, had shrunk to a muddy trickle that the cattle refused to drink from. The wooden storefronts along Main Street had warped in the heat until the boards buckled outward like the ribs of a starving animal, and the dust that rose from the unpaved road had a particular quality to it. Fine, suffocating, the kind that worked its way into the back of your throat and stayed there no matter how many times you swallowed. Lydia Mercer noticed all of it. She noticed the cracked mud along the edge of the road, the way it broke into perfect little hexagons like some kind of geological joke. She noticed the hollow look in the eyes of the two men sitting outside the barbershop, neither of them talking, both of them staring at nothing with the particular vacancy of men who'd already done their accounting for the day and found the numbers wanting. She noticed the way Mrs. Hallett's curtains on the second floor of the boarding house shifted when she passed. Someone watching, always someone watching in a town this small. She noticed all of it because noticing things was the only thing she had any control over anymore. The coins were in her left hand, squeezed tight enough in her fist that the edges of them were biting into her palm. She'd counted them that morning sitting on the edge of the bed she'd shared with Thomas for 6 years, the bed that still somehow smelled like him even after 8 weeks, that particular smell of pine resin and iron dust, and the cheap soap he'd used every Saturday night before church. She'd counted them twice because 13 felt like a wrong number, like the universe making a point. 3 pennies, a dime, 13 cents. She'd counted them again and gotten 13 again, and then she'd just sat there for a while with them in her palm and listened to the sound of the wind against the side of the house that wasn't going to be hers much longer if she couldn't find a way to service the debt. Don't think about that right now, she told herself. One thing at a time. One thing at a time was how you survived. Thomas had taught her that, back when the Mercer claim had been producing enough silver ore to keep them fed and clothed, and not much more. Back before the prices dropped, and the debt climbed, and the walls of the number 4 shaft had started showing that particular pattern of cracks that Thomas had called the writing on the wall, without quite understanding how literal he was being. You don't think about next month when next week is already uncertain. You think about today. You think about the specific problem in front of you right now. Right now, the problem was bread. She pushed open the door to Halbrook's General Store, and the little bell above it rang with a cheerfulness that seemed almost cruel. The store was cooler than outside, or at least it felt that way for the first few seconds before the heat reasserted itself. It smelled the way it always smelled, tobacco and leather and dried spices, and something underneath all of it that was just commerce, the smell of goods and money changing hands, of the whole transactional machinery of survival. Shelves lined every wall from floor to nearly ceiling, and the goods on them represented everything a person needed to stay alive in this part of Colorado. Flour in 50-pound sacks, salt pork in sealed barrels, coffee, dried beans, lamp oil, rope, nails, sewing thread in a dozen colors. A 16-year-old boy named Emmett Halbrook was sweeping the floor near the back. He looked up when she came in and something crossed his face. Not quite pity, but adjacent to it. He'd grown up with the Mercer name meaning something. His father had extended them credit the first 2 years they'd been working the claim. His mother had brought a casserole when Thomas died, one of 8 women who'd shown up that first week with food and condolences, and then gradually stopped coming the way people did when tragedy stretched on, past the period when grief was still interesting. "Mrs. Mercer," Emmett said, and then didn't seem to know what else to say. "Emmett." She nodded at him and moved toward the bread counter. There was a fresh loaf there, She could see it from across the store, golden brown, probably baked that morning. The smell of it hit her, and her stomach made a sound she was grateful nobody else heard. She was reaching for it when the door at the back of the store opened and Silas Crow walked in. There was always a moment, a specific physical moment, when Silas Crow entered a room, and it wasn't the dramatic kind you might expect from a man of his particular variety of power. It wasn't loud. He didn't announce himself. He was a compact man, middle 50s, with a gray beard kept so precisely trimmed it looked like it had been drawn on with a ruler. He wore good wool even in summer, which was either a statement or a genuine indifference to discomfort, and he moved with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has never in his adult life needed to rush because the world simply waits for him. What happened when he entered a room was more subtle than drama. It was more like a shift in barometric pressure. Conversations stopped or changed direction. People made small adjustments, a straightening of posture, an angling away, a sudden interest in whatever their hands were doing. Emmett Halbrook immediately stopped sweeping and started looking busy in a way that involved not looking at anyone. Lydia had seen it happen hundreds of times in the 6 years she'd lived in Caldwell Creek. She'd always found it faintly disgusting. She found it significantly less faint now. Crow saw her immediately. She was, after all, the only other person standing in the middle of the store, and he had the kind of eyes that cataloged information the way some men catalog debts, automatically, thoroughly, with a view toward future use. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. His voice was pleasant. That was the thing people who hadn't dealt with him closely didn't quite understand. The voice was pleasant, the manners were impeccable, and the cruelty was entirely architectural, built into the structure of the situations he arranged rather than into any particular rudeness he displayed. "Mr. Crow," she said. She turned back to the bread. She picked it up. She carried it to the counter where a handwritten price was chalked on a small board. Bread. 15 cents. 15 cents! She stood there and looked at that number for a moment. 2 cents more than what she had. She'd been to this store 1,000 times, and she had never once stood at this counter and actually read the price of bread because it had never been something she needed to read. Behind her, she could feel Crow watching. "Emmett," she said, keeping her voice even. "Is there anything smaller? Half a loaf, maybe?" Emmett Halbrook opened his mouth and then glanced sideways at Crow, and then looked back at her with an expression of genuine misery. I don't think we sell halves, ma'am. I could ask my pa—" "His father isn't here," Crow said pleasantly. He'd moved to stand near the end of the counter, the way men like him moved. Not confrontationally, just there, part of the geometry of the room now. "And in any case, Emmett, your father has extended the Mercer account rather beyond its useful limits, hasn't he? I believe Mrs. Mercer already carries a balance here." Lydia's jaw tightened. The balance was $4.30, a fact she was aware of every single morning when she woke up. "I have cash today," she said. She opened her hand on the counter. 13 copper cents. The silence that followed was not long, but it was complete. Emmett stared at the coins. Crow looked at them with the careful expression of a man who is performing the act of not quite smiling. "I see," Crow said. "I'm 2 cents short," she said, and hated the way those words sounded coming out of her mouth. "I was wondering if Emmett here would simply give you the bread." Crow tilted his head slightly. "As charity?" "As credit," she said. 2 cents of credit against an account that already stands at—" He made a small gesture, dismissive, the kind you'd make regarding an unimportant detail, a considerable amount. "And with the Mercer property's status being what it is, I'm not certain any further credit extension would be—" "My property's status," she said, and turned to face him then, "is that it belongs to me." "Currently," Crow said. It was one word. Just the one word. And it was said perfectly pleasantly, the way you'd agree with someone about the weather. Lydia Mercer had been born in Missouri and had come west at 19 with Thomas and $40 between them and a belief that hard work meant something. She had survived 2 failed harvests, a miscarriage, 2 winters that nearly broke them both in ways they never fully talked about, and 8 weeks now of widowhood with hunger working steadily at her insides. She was not a woman given to scenes or histrionics. Thomas had always said she had more spine than most men he knew, and he'd meant it as the highest compliment. She picked her 13 cents up off the counter, put them back in her fist. "Good day, Mr. Crow," she said. She walked to the door. The bell rang again when she opened it. The heat outside hit her like a hand pressed flat against her face. She walked. She didn't run. Running felt like something that could be seen and judged and reported back. And in a town where everything was someone else's information eventually, the walk was a kind of statement. She walked with her back straight and her eyes forward and the 13 cents cutting into her palm, and she didn't look back. There had been a man in the corner of the store. He'd been there the whole time, standing near a display of rope and chain at the far end of the back wall, angled slightly away from the main floor in the particular way of someone who has spent enough time in outdoor spaces that the instinct to position himself near a wall and slightly out of the main sightline had become simply the way he occupied rooms. He was tall, not remarkable tall, but genuinely tall, with the kind of build that suggested not exercise but work, real sustained physical work over a long period of time. His coat was canvas, worn to softness, and it had the look of something that had spent considerable time in weather. His hat was off, held in one hand, and his hair was dark with threads of gray at the temples, cut short enough to be practical. He had a face that had been in the sun a lot, not tanned the way men got who worked in sun by choice, but the deeper weathering of someone for whom the outdoors was simply the condition of existing. His name was Ronan Hale, and he had come into Halbrook's general store that morning to buy coffee and a spool of copper wire and possibly some salt pork if the price hadn't gone up again, and instead he had stood very still for the last 4 minutes, watching something that made him feel low and slow in his chest, a particular kind of anger. He watched Lydia Mercer walk out the door. The bell rang, and then the door fell shut, and she was gone. Crow turned then, back toward the rear of the store, toward whatever business he'd actually come in for, and his eyes moved across Ronan Hale with the same cataloging quality they brought to everything. He didn't stop on him. Hale was a known figure in the area. Trapper, sometimes worked as a surveyor's assistant, lived alone up past the tree line in a cabin he'd built himself sometime around 1876. Not a man of consequence, not a man whose gaze warranted tracking. Crow walked to the back counter and began talking to Emmett about something Ronan didn't listen to. Ronan looked down at the rope in his hand, which he'd picked up without knowing he'd done it, and set it carefully back on the hook where it belonged. He paid for his coffee and his wire. He didn't buy the salt pork. He nodded to Emmett and didn't look at Crow at all and went out through the door. The heat hit him the same way it hit everyone, but he'd been working in it long enough that it was more information than discomfort. Temperature, humidity, the particular quality of the air that told him it wasn't going to rain. He stood on the wooden sidewalk outside Halbrook's and looked up and down Main Street. He saw her about 100 yards away, walking north in the direction of the Mercer property. He could tell from the set of her shoulders that she hadn't cried yet. He knew that particular set. He'd seen it before, in different people in different situations, the posture of someone who is holding something at bay through the simple act of not stopping. He stood there for a while after she disappeared around the bend. Then he went to his horse, which was hitched outside the hardware store further down the street, and he started working through what he knew. The Mercer property was 40 acres of rough land in the foothills northeast of town, and it had one significant feature: the No. 4 mine shaft, sunk 11 years ago by a previous owner named Connolly, who'd gone bust and sold the claim for $160 to a young couple from Missouri who'd seemed, to most of the town, like people who were going to work very hard and ultimately fail in a moderately quiet way. Thomas Mercer had not been a sophisticated man. He'd been a decent man, which is different and sometimes harder. He'd worked the No. 4 without fully understanding what he had, producing ore that assayed at modest grades. Enough to keep going, not enough to thrive. He'd borrowed against the claim when times were tight, which they usually were, and the debt had accumulated the way debt does when you're always almost making it, always just slightly behind, always one bad month away from crisis. In February, the No. 4's main shaft had collapsed. 3 men died. Thomas Mercer was one of them. The collapse had been investigated by the mine inspector out of Denver, a man named Aldous Price, who'd spent 2 days in Caldwell Creek, written a report citing structural inadequacy and improper reinforcement as the cause, and gone back to Denver. The report didn't assign blame to any individual. It didn't have to. Blame in situations like this was a luxury that required either money or political influence to pursue, and the widows and families of the 3 dead men had neither. Lydia had known all of this. She'd known it the way you know a thing that is too large and too wrong to entirely look at. You look at the edges of it and try to understand the shape. What she didn't know, what nobody in Caldwell Creek knew, or at least nobody was talking about, was what exactly sat underneath those 40 acres of rough foothills ground. Ronan Hale had an idea. It was more than an idea, actually. It was a suspicion that had been forming for about 3 months, since the day he'd been working a survey line up in the hills northeast of town for a contract job and had found, buried under a fall of stones near an old creek bed, a surveyor's stake that had no business being there. The stake was iron, and it was old enough that the markings on it were almost weathered away, but not quite. He'd cleaned it off carefully with his knife and read what was stamped into it, a claim notation, coordinates, and a date that was 8 years old. 8 years ago, someone had surveyed the land that was now the Mercer claim. Someone who wasn't Thomas Mercer, because Thomas Mercer hadn't arrived until 6 years ago. Ronan had turned that stake over in his hands for a long time and thought about who might have commissioned a survey of that particular piece of ground 8 years ago, and why. And whether it was a coincidence that the man who now controlled most of the mining claims in the surrounding valley had arrived in Caldwell Creek approximately 8 years and 2 months ago. He hadn't done anything with the information yet. You didn't move on something like that without being careful, because if you were wrong, you were just a man spreading rumors about someone powerful, and if you were right, you were a man who had put himself in front of something dangerous. But watching Lydia Mercer walk out of Holbrook's store with her last 13 cents still in her hand, he thought maybe being careful had a time limit on it. The Mercer house was what people in the area called a claim house, not built to last, built to serve. 2 rooms with a packed dirt floor in the kitchen and wooden boards in the bedroom. A fireplace that drew imperfectly, a well out back that had never quite produced the water it should. Thomas had planned to build something better. He'd talked about it sometimes in the evenings, elaborate plans for a proper frame house with glass windows and a proper kitchen range. Lydia had listened and believed him, because believing Thomas had always been something she chose to do deliberately, a choice she made about who she was in relation to who he was. She sat at the kitchen table now, with the coins in front of her, and looked at them and thought clearly and practically about her situation, the way she'd been trained to do since she was 9 years old, and her mother had made her sit down and account for every cent of the household money every Sunday evening. The debt to Holbrook's was $4.30. The debt to the bank, not the bank in Caldwell Creek, which didn't have one, but the mining bank out of Leadville that had backed Thomas's last round of shaft improvements, was $62. The property taxes were 8 months overdue. She had received last week a document from Crow's legal representative, a lawyer named Fitch who wore Eastern suits and had no visible connection to this landscape, informing her that the debt Thomas had contracted 2 years ago with the Crow Land and Resource Company for equipment purchase was now being called in at the full amount plus penalties. The full amount plus penalties was $91. She did not have $91. She did not have $9. She had 13 cents. She'd done everything she could think of to do. She'd written to Thomas's brother in Kansas City, who'd written back with sympathy and a careful explanation of why he couldn't help financially. She'd spoken to the minister who'd suggested charity that she'd politely declined because charity had a cost she couldn't afford to pay. She'd spoken to 2 men in town who might have bought the claim from her, and both conversations had ended with offers so low they were offensive, offers that made the mathematics of what she owed and what she'd receive result in a number that was still negative. She was not stupid. She understood what was happening in a general way. She understood that someone wanted her land and was applying pressure in the systematic way that power applies pressure. Through debt, through legal process, through the attrition of a person's options, until the only one remaining is the one that benefits the party with more leverage. What she didn't understand was why. Why her particular 40 acres, which had produced modest ore at best, which sat in an unspectacular section of foothill, which had no particular attribute she could identify that would make it worth the coordinated campaign of pressure she was experiencing. She looked at the 13 cents. She was hungry. She had been managing it by spacing out the cornmeal she had left in the sack near the stove, a 1/4 cup in the morning and a 1/4 cup at night. Not enough to feel full, but enough to keep functioning, which was what mattered. She'd been doing this for 5 days. She was very tired. Outside, the wind had picked up, pushing a dust devil across the yard. and she watched it through the cracked window glass and thought about Thomas, specifically about his hands. Big hands, scarred across the knuckles, hands that had held hers the night of the miscarriage and hadn't let go until morning came. "I don't know what to do," she said out loud. She rarely talked to herself, but the silence of the house had gotten very large recently. She sat with not knowing for about 30 seconds. Then she got up and went to the fireplace and checked what was left of the cornmeal. He knocked after dark. This was, she would later realize, deliberate. A person who shows up at a widow's door in daylight in a small town is observed, noted, discussed. After dark was not safer in any physical sense, but it was quieter in a social sense, and Ronan Hale had clearly thought about the distinction. She had the door open a crack before he could knock a second time, because she'd heard the horse coming up the road and had taken the precaution of picking up the small iron pan from the stove. He had a burlap sack in one hand and his hat in the other, and he stood there in the dark with the horse behind him and the stars above him, and the patient expression of someone who has practiced explaining himself to skeptical people. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I was in Hallbrooks this morning." She looked at him for a moment. She remembered him vaguely, the tall man near the back, the one who'd been there the whole time without being part of what happened. "I know who you are," she said. "You're the trapper that lives up the mountain." "Ronan Hale," he confirmed. "What's in the sack?" "Flour, salt pork, coffee, 2 cans of peaches." He paused. "I'm not bringing it as charity. I'm bringing it because I'm going to need your help with something, and I'd rather not have you starving while I try to explain it." She looked at the sack for a moment. "What kind of help?" she said. "The kind that requires you to trust me about as far as you can throw me," he said, "which I understand is not far, given we've exchanged maybe 12 words total in the past 6 years. 9, she said. "I counted, and 6 of them were yours." Something moved across his face, not quite a smile, but adjacent to one. "Fair enough." She thought about it for a moment. The honest truth was that she could smell the salt pork through the burlap, and her stomach had immediately made a decision that the rest of her was still catching up to. She stepped back from the door. "Come in then," she said. He sat at her kitchen table with his hat on his knee and told her about the surveyor's stake. He told her slowly and carefully, the way you tell something to someone who has a right to be angry about it. Not dumping information on them, but laying it out in pieces, giving each piece time to settle before adding the next. He told her about the survey coordinates and the date, and what they implied about when someone had become aware of the significant mineral potential of this specific piece of land. He told her about Crow's arrival in the valley 8 years ago, and the gradual, methodical way that Crow had positioned himself as the primary creditor and equipment supplier and general economic landlord of the mining operations in the area. He told her he wasn't certain yet. He wanted to be clear about that. He had a surveyor's stake, and a pattern of observations and a suspicion that fit together in a way he found alarming, but he didn't have proof. Lydia listened to all of it without interrupting. She was eating the salt pork he'd brought, eating it plain without even bread because she hadn't wanted to wait for the fire to come up, and she was listening while she ate with the focused attention of someone who has learned not to miss information. When he finished, she was quiet for a while. "You think there's silver under my land?" she said. "Significant silver," he said. "If the survey date is what I think it is, and if Crow acted on it the way I think he acted on it, then yes, a large deposit, possibly very large. And you think Crow knew about it before Thomas died?" He didn't answer immediately, which was in itself an answer. "I think," he said carefully, "that the timing of certain things, the escalation of Thomas's debt, the pressure on the claim, the mine inspector's report, I think the timing warrants serious questions." She set down the salt pork. "You're saying you think he killed my husband," she said. Her voice was even, frighteningly even. "I'm saying I think someone knew things about your land that they shouldn't have known, and I think that someone had reasons to want Thomas out of the picture, and I think the mine inspector's report didn't ask the questions it should have asked." He met her eyes. "I'm not saying I can prove any of that yet." She looked at him for a long time. He didn't look away and didn't rush her. "Why are you doing this?" she said. It was the honest question, the one that cut through the practical discussion to the actual mystery, which was why a man who lived alone in a mountain cabin and made it his business to stay out of other people's business had shown up at her door with a burlap sack and a dangerous theory. He thought about the honest answer for a moment. "I watched you walk out of that store today," he said finally, "with nothing after what that man did. And I've watched things like that happen in this town for a while now, and I kept deciding it wasn't my problem." He looked down at his hat. "I don't want to keep doing that." It wasn't a heroic answer. It wasn't polished, but it was, she sensed, exactly true. She looked at the window. Outside was full dark now, the mountains invisible but present. That particular presence of large things you can feel without seeing. "If there's silver down there," she said slowly, "if everything you're describing is even half right, then he's not going to stop until he has the land," Ronan said. "The legal pressure, the debt, Fitch showing up with his papers." He paused. "He thinks he has time. He thinks you're going to fold." "What would it take," she said, "to prove it?" "The original survey document, something tying Crow to the Survey Commission 8 years ago, and something connecting his knowledge of the deposit to the decisions that were made about the number 4. He paused. "Thomas didn't keep records? Notes?" She went very still. "I haven't gone through his things yet," she said quietly. "His papers. I haven't been able to. The admission cost her something. He could see it." "There's no hurry tonight," he said. "Yes, there is," she said, and stood up from the table. Thomas Mercer had not been a man who threw things away. This was both a virtue and a logistical challenge, because it meant that the wooden crate he kept under the bedroom floor, beneath a board that Lydia had known about and deliberately not acknowledged for the past 8 weeks, contained 8 years of accumulated correspondence, receipts, claim documents, assay reports, and personal notes in Thomas's cramped, slightly leftward-leaning handwriting. She dragged the crate out while Ronan waited in the kitchen. He'd offered to help, and she'd said no with a look that made the offer unnecessary to decline twice. She sat on the bed with the crate and went through it. The assay reports first. She spread them in order. Thomas had dated everything, thank God, and read through them slowly. They were, as she'd understood, modest. Low-grade ore. Nothing remarkable. The correspondence was mostly with the Leadville Bank, increasingly tense letters about repayment schedules and interest rates that made her jaw tighten. Nothing useful there beyond confirming what she already knew about the debt. The equipment purchase receipts from the Crow Land and Resource Company were there. 3 separate purchases over 2 years, all signed by Thomas, all stamped with the company's seal, all with interest rates that had been explained to Thomas as standard, but which she now, looking at them with the cold clarity of someone who has nothing left to lose, could see were constructed to compound in a specific way that made them nearly impossible to service. She was halfway through the box when she found the note. It was folded twice and tucked inside the back cover of the claim ledger, which Thomas had kept in his characteristically thorough way. Every shift recorded, every ore haul weighed and noted, every unusual event logged with a date and a brief description. The note was not in Thomas's handwriting. It was in a precise, small hand she didn't recognize, and it read, T. Fitch was at the claim again, 3rd time this month. He's measuring things he has no business measuring. I think Crow has already commissioned a survey you don't know about. I don't know what's down there, but he does, and that's why he's circling. Be careful with the number 4 and watch who you let in. Destroy this. W. She read it twice. She read it a 3rd time. Destroy this. Thomas had not destroyed it. Thomas, who kept everything, had tucked it inside his ledger and kept it, perhaps meaning to destroy it later and never getting to later. She stood up and went to the kitchen. Ronan looked at her face when she came through the door, and he went still. "What did you find?" he said. She set the note on the table. He read it once. Then he looked up at her. "Who is W?" she said. "I don't know," he said. "But this—" He touched the note carefully, the edge of it. "This is someone who knew. Someone who warned him. And someone killed him 6 months later," she said. The kitchen was very quiet. The fire in the stove had gone down to coals, and the room had the particular quality of somewhere that decisions get made. Small room, solid walls, the weight of the mountains all around. "We need the survey," Ronan said. "This note and the stake and the pattern, it's not enough. A note from an unknown source and a piece of iron I found in the hills. Any lawyer Crow hires, and he has 3, will take those apart in an hour. Where would the survey be?" He thought about it. If Crow commissioned it privately, Before he had any official claim to the land, he'd keep it somewhere he controls. His office in town. Possibly his house. He paused. Or with Fitch. Can we get it? He looked at her steadily. Getting it means going somewhere we don't have a right to be and taking something we can't openly acknowledge we took. Can we get it? She said again. He was quiet for a moment. I might know a way, he said, but it's going to take a few days. And in the meantime, we need to be careful about what we show and what we don't. If Crow thinks we're looking, he'll move faster, she said. Yes. She picked up the note and folded it back along its original creases. I'll keep this safe, she said. What do you need from me? He looked at her across the table. This woman who'd walked out of a store with 13 cents 2 hours ago and was now talking about evidence and strategy with the careful focus of someone who has decided, completely and without drama, to fight. Get some sleep, he said, and eat the rest of that salt pork. He stood and picked up his hat. I'll be back in 2 days. She walked him to the door. At the threshold, he stopped and looked back at her. One more thing, he said. Don't let Fitch serve you anything else without having a witness present. Whatever he hands you, have someone else see you receive it. Why? Because if they're moving to a legal process, they'll want to control what you know and when you know it. A witness changes the shape of that. She nodded. He put on his hat and went out into the dark. She heard the horse move off down the road, the sound of it diminishing slowly through the still night air. She shut the door. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the 13 cents still on the table where she'd left them that afternoon. She picked them up and put them in her pocket and went to rebuild the fire. Over the next 2 days, Caldwell Creek went about its business with the stolid determination of a place that has learned not to expect too much from the world. Tom Ashby opened his smithy at 6 every morning and worked until the light failed. The Delacroix brothers ran their cattle down from the high pasture and started the slow process of culling the ones that hadn't gained enough weight for market. Emmett Halbrook swept the floor of the store with the same broom and the same mechanical motion he'd been using since he was 12. The saloon at the end of Main Street did its business in the evenings. Not prosperous business, but persistent business, the kind that a certain kind of thirst generates reliably. And Silas Crow moved through all of it the way he always did. Present without being visible, influential without being loud, the fixed point around which the town's economic life orbited whether the town acknowledged it or not. He had 2 men he used for certain kinds of work. One was named Drury, who had a battered face and a very flat affect, the look of a man from whom all the interesting complexity had been worn away, leaving something functional and not much else. The other was a younger man called Keene, who was smarter than Drury and therefore more careful in ways that made him more dangerous. These 2 men appeared, the day after Ronan Hale's visit, sitting on a fence at the edge of town in the direction of the Mercer property. Not blocking the road, not doing anything that could be called threatening, just sitting there with the particular patience of men who are paid to sit. Lydia saw them when she rode into town for supplies, using the last of the flour from Ronan's sack to buy something with, exchanging it at the mill for a small amount of cash credit, making her rounds with the careful economy of someone stretching every resource as far as it will go. She didn't look at them directly, but she noted them the way she'd noted everything since she was small. The position of them on the fence, the angle of their attention, what they were watching and what they were pretending not to watch. They were watching the road to her place. She went about her business. She stopped to talk to Martha Colby outside the feed store because Martha Colby was one of the few women in town who had never stopped coming around after Thomas died, and also because Martha's husband Jim worked at the land office and occasionally said things that were useful without knowing they were being useful. Hot enough for you? Martha said. Almost, Lydia said. How's Jim? Tired. He's been dealing with a lot of filing lately. Martha lowered her voice slightly, which in Martha's case meant she was about to say something real. A lot of claim paperwork moving through the office, transfers and liens and whatnot, more than usual for this time of year. Lydia kept her face neutral. That right? Martha glanced around with the practiced, casual look of a woman who has lived her whole life in a small town and knows exactly how to look at things without appearing to look. Some of it's to do with properties out your way. Lydia said nothing, which was sometimes the most useful response to a woman who wanted to say more. I'm not saying anything I should repeat, Martha said. I know you're not, Lydia said. Just don't let anything expire. She met Lydia's eyes for a moment. You understand? Anything with a date on it. I understand, Lydia said. They talked about the heat for another few minutes, and then Lydia rode home and sat with what Martha had just told her, which was that Crow was moving documents through the land office at a rate that suggested a specific timeline, and that someone, Jim Colby probably, who was a decent man stuck in a complicated position, was trying to give her a warning he couldn't give her directly. Don't let anything expire. She had, by her count, 9 days before the deadline on the Crow land and resource debt. 9 days during which, if the debt was not serviced, Fitch could file for lien foreclosure on the claim. 9 days. She was still sitting with this when she heard a horse on the road, and it was Ronan Hale, 2 days after he'd said 2 days, which she noted without quite meaning to as a man who did what he said he was going to do. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door, and when she let him in, she could see from the look on his face, not excited, but something with tension in it, something coiled, that 2 days had not been wasted. I found something, he said. He'd been up to the hills northeast of the claim, working backward from the surveyor's stake he'd found 3 months ago, tracing the survey line as best he could, reconstruct it from the position of the stake and the natural topography. Surveyors worked in patterns. If you knew one point and you knew the methodology, you could often find the next. He'd found 2 more stakes. One of them had scratched into the iron very lightly. Scratched, not stamped, the kind of mark you made when you didn't want it easily found or identified. A 2-letter abbreviation and a number. CLR and the number 7. CLR, Crow Land and Resource. That's not proof of concealment, she said. They were at the table again. He'd laid out his notes, hand-drawn, careful, the notes of someone who'd spent time learning to observe things accurately. That's just proof he surveyed it. What he surveyed and when and what he did with the information afterward, Ronan said. The survey predates any business relationship with Thomas by 2 years. It predates Thomas owning the claim. Crow commissioned a survey of land he had no formal interest in, found what he found, and then manufactured a reason to get close to the claim, she finished. The equipment debt, he said. The terms were structured so that Thomas couldn't possibly stay current on them. But to prove it, we need the actual survey document, the full document with the SA projections. What I found is consistent with my theory. It isn't the theory proven. Where's the document? He was quiet for a moment. Fitch's office, he said. Fitch keeps everything for Crow. Crow's own records are too well guarded. But Fitch, he paused. Fitch is an Eastern lawyer who came out here thinking he understood how things worked and is now deep enough into what Crow is doing that he can't afford to look at it clearly. He keeps good records because he's a lawyer, including records that Crow probably told him to keep somewhere private. How do you know where Fitch keeps his records? Because I did some carpentry work on his office building last spring, Ronan said. And because men like Fitch don't think the people who fix their buildings are paying close attention. Are you telling me, she said slowly, that you want to break into a lawyer's office? I'm telling you I know where the private files are in a building I've been inside, he said, and that if we had the survey document, we would have something real. She looked at him for a long time. And if we're caught, then we become the problem instead of Crow, he said. He didn't dress it up. I know what I'm asking. No, she said. You're not asking me to do it. You're going to do it, and you're telling me so I understand the risk to both of us if it goes wrong. He didn't deny it. She stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark. 9 days. When? She said. Tomorrow night, he said. Fitch goes to the saloon every Tuesday. He stays 2 hours. It's enough. She turned from the window. Come back for breakfast, she said. We can go over the timing. He put on his hat and went to the door. He stopped, as he had before, at the threshold. You doing all right? He said. Not politely, actually asking. She thought about it. I'm angrier than I've been in my life, she said. Which helps, honestly. He nodded once. Good, he said, and went out into the dark, and she stood for a moment in the quiet house with the note from Thomas's ledger in her pocket, and the names CLR turning over in her mind, and felt something she hadn't felt in 8 weeks. She felt like she was in motion. Ronan came back at first light, which was earlier than breakfast by most people's standards, but Lydia had been up since 4 and the coffee was already on. He sat down without being told to and wrapped both hands around the cup she set in front of him and didn't say anything for a minute, which she was beginning to understand was just how he was. A man who didn't fill silence because silence made him uncomfortable. He filled it when he had something worth saying. Drury and Keene were on the South Road again this morning, he said, earlier than yesterday. I know. I saw them from the window. She sat across from him. They're not hiding that they're watching. No, he said. They're not meant to. The watching is the point. She understood that. The watching was pressure the same way the debt was pressure, the same way Fitch's legal documents were pressure. A coordinated effort to make her feel the walls coming in from every direction until the only thing that seemed rational was to sign whatever they put in front of her and walk away with whatever small amount they offered that let her preserve some shred of dignity on the way out. 8 days now, she said. I know. She poured herself coffee and they sat with that number for a moment. 8 days had a specific weight to it, not quite desperate, but close enough to taste. Tell me exactly how the office is laid out, she said. He did. He was good at describing spaces. He'd spent enough of his life navigating terrain that spatial detail had become a kind of language for him. Fitch's office was a 2-room building on the east side of Caldwell Creek's main street, the second room behind the first being where Fitch kept his files. The filing cabinet was a heavy iron thing against the back wall, 4 drawers, and the bottom drawer had a different kind of lock on it than the others. A better lock, newer, the kind you added when the contents required more protection than the standard hardware provided. I can get through it, Ronan said. It'll take 10 minutes with the right tool, maybe 15. And Fitch is reliably at the saloon from when to when? 8 o'clock to 10. Tuesdays he plays cards with Aldous Price when Price is in town, and Price is in town this week. I saw his horse at the hotel this morning. Aldous Price, the mine inspector. The man who'd written the report that didn't ask the questions it should have asked. Lydia set down her cup. Price is here, she said. Not a question. Arrived yesterday. That's not a coincidence. No, Ronan said. It's not. She thought about what it meant. The mine inspector back in town, in the same week that Crow's legal deadline was approaching, playing cards with Crow's lawyer. It meant something was being coordinated. She didn't know exactly what, but the shape of it was visible in the same way you could see the shape of a mountain in fog. Not the details, but the mass of it, unmistakable. We go tonight, she said. He looked at her. I go tonight. You. I'm not sitting here while you take all the risk, she said. If you're caught alone, Crow buries it. If I'm there, it's the widow of the man whose land is being stolen breaking into a lawyer's office to find out why. That's a different story. He was quiet for a moment, turning his cup. She could see him working through it, not dismissing her, actually considering it, which she appreciated more than she would have expected. You'd have to be fast, he said. I'm not slow. And if someone sees us, then we deal with that when it happens. She met his eyes. I'm not asking your permission, Ronan. It was the first time she'd used his given name. He noticed it, and she noticed him notice it, and they both let it sit there without making anything of it. All right, he said, but you do what I say when I say it. No arguments in the moment. Agreed, she said. He drank his coffee. Outside, the early light was coming through the cracked window glass and making a pattern on the floor that shifted slightly as the wind moved the cottonwood outside. It was going to be another brutal day. The heat was already present in the air, that particular pre-dawn warmth that meant by noon it would be nearly unendurable. There's something else, he said. She waited. I talked to Tom Ashby last night, the blacksmith. He set down his cup. He knew Thomas. They drank together sometimes. He told me something I didn't know. Apparently about 3 weeks before the collapse, Thomas came to him and asked him to look at a piece of timber, a support timber from inside the number 4. She went still. Thomas pulled it out himself and brought it to Tom. Said something about it looked wrong. Tom said it was wrong. It had been cut partway through on the interior face, not where you'd see it from the shaft side. He said it looked like someone had weakened it deliberately. The kitchen was very quiet. Thomas never said anything to me, she said. Her voice came out lower than she intended. Tom said he told Thomas to go to the mine inspector. Thomas said he was going to. He paused. 3 weeks later, the shaft came down. She put both hands flat on the table. Not for drama, because she needed to feel something solid. She'd known, in the way you know things you can't let yourself look at directly, that Thomas's death had been something more than bad luck and inadequate timber. She'd known it the way you know a wound is worse than it looks. The knowledge was there, underneath, before you're ready to examine it. But knowing a thing in that loose, unexamined way is entirely different from having someone sit across your kitchen table and say the words out loud with a face that tells you it's true. "He was going to report it," she said, "and instead he died." "That's what I think happened." "And Price?" "The inspector who was supposed to investigate," Ronan said carefully, "wrote a report that didn't find anything unusual about the structural failure. And now Price is in town playing cards with Fitch." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that the light through the window shifted perceptibly. "Okay," she said finally. Her voice was steady. Steadier than she felt, but she'd been managing that gap for 8 weeks now, and had gotten reasonably good at it. "Tonight we get the survey document, and whatever else is in that bottom drawer that Fitch felt the need to put a better lock on." Ronan nodded. "And Tom Ashby," she said. "Would he say what he told you, officially, to the right people?" "I think he might. He's been carrying it for 3 months and it's sitting badly on him." "Good," she said. "Keep him warm on it. Don't push him. Just keep him warm." He looked at her with something she couldn't quite name. Not surprise exactly, but a recalibration, a slight adjustment in how he was seeing her. She'd seen that look before, on men who had decided in advance what a woman in her position was capable of, and were now revising the number upward. She didn't acknowledge it. She refilled his coffee and started talking through the timing for that evening. They spent 2 hours on it. She was precise, and he was thorough, and they worked well together in a way that had no explanation other than that some people's minds fit together on a problem the way certain tools fit certain tasks. Not because there was anything romantic about it, but because the practical urgency of what they were doing created its own kind of alignment. At 7:30 he left to put in an appearance at the hardware store in town. Normal business. Nothing unusual, the kind of visible, ordinary behavior that was its own form of cover. She watched him ride away down the road and then went inside and started going through Thomas's ledger again, looking for anything else she might have missed the first time. She found it on page 47. A note in the margin, small, in Thomas's handwriting, not meant for anyone but himself. "Fitch here again. Measuring east boundary. Asked about subsurface rights." Why? Subsurface rights. 2 words in Thomas's marginal handwriting that meant he'd been paying attention. That meant he'd noticed something was wrong and had been quietly trying to understand it, in the way that careful, unschooled men try to understand things, by watching, by noting, by asking quiet questions. He just hadn't asked them fast enough. She closed the ledger and sat with the particular grief of understanding someone better after they were gone than you did when they were present. Thomas had been a man who held things close. She'd always known that. She'd found it frustrating sometimes, early in their marriage, the way he'd work through a worry privately until it was resolved before he'd tell her about it. She'd asked him once why he did that, and he'd said, simply, that he didn't want to worry her with problems that might turn out to be nothing. She had told him, with some heat, that she'd rather be worried together than excluded. He'd taken that in with his characteristic stillness, and said she was probably right, and then had continued doing exactly what he'd always done because people don't change the fundamental way they process the world just because someone points out its limitations. She'd made her peace with it. It was one of the things about him she'd held on to with the specific tenderness you reserve for the imperfections of people you love. Now, sitting with his ledger, she wished she'd pushed harder. She wished she'd known what he was carrying. She wished for a lot of things that wishing couldn't help, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly the amount of time she could afford, which was about 4 minutes, and then she put the ledger in the hiding spot under the bedroom board and went to check on the horse. The afternoon went slowly in the way that afternoons before something dangerous always go slowly, time becoming thick, every ordinary task carrying more weight than it should. She fed the horse and mended a fence post that had been leaning for weeks, and made a meal from the supplies Ronan had brought and sat on the front step in the early evening, watching the dust devils move across the dry yard, and thought about what she was about to do. She was not a person who had ever broken a law in her life. She had opinions about laws. Some of them seemed reasonable. Some of them seemed designed to benefit the people who wrote them. But she'd lived within them because that was what you did when you didn't have the power to do otherwise. Tonight, she was going to break into a lawyer's office and take documents that weren't hers to take. She thought about Thomas's timber, cut halfway through on the interior face where nobody would see it. She thought about Emmett Halbrook's face at the counter when she'd put down 13 cents. She thought about the note, "Destroy this," that Thomas had not destroyed. Then she went inside and changed into her darkest clothes and waited for Ronan. He came at 7:30, as arranged. He had 2 horses, his own and a borrowed mare he'd saddled without explanation, which she appreciated. He'd thought about it and prepared rather than assuming she'd ride behind him. Small thing. Not small. They didn't talk much on the ride in. The town was quiet at that hour, the saloon lit and audible from 2 blocks away, the rest of Main Street largely dark. Fitch's office was at the East End, away from the saloon, which was either fortunate or Fitch had chosen the location deliberately for the same reason. They tied the horses in the alley behind the assay office, 1 building down. Ronan had a canvas tool roll under his arm. He'd been thinking about the lock for a while, she could tell. There was a specific quality of focus on him, the way a person looks when they've run through a sequence of actions in their mind enough times that the physical execution is mostly a matter of not rushing. "Back window," he said quietly. "Latch is loose on the left side. I noticed it when I was doing the roof work." She followed him around the back of the buildings through the dark. The back alley smelled of dust and horse and the particular garbage smell of a small town in summer heat. She kept her footfalls quiet without being told to. The window was low, half height, the kind that let light into a back room without providing much of a view. He worked the latch with a thin piece of flat metal from his tool roll. Not a dramatic procedure, but a slow, careful one. And when the latch gave, it gave quietly, and the window swung inward on oiled hinges. They were inside in under a minute. The back room was dark and smelled of paper and lamp oil. Ronan had a small lantern with a tight aperture, the kind that threw a narrow beam rather than flooding the room, and he used it to find the filing cabinet against the wall. 3 of the 4 drawers had standard locks, already open. The bottom drawer had the better one. He crouched in front of it and worked on it in silence while she stood near the window and listened to the sounds of the building and the street outside. 8 minutes. She was counting in her head. At 10 minutes, she'd say something. At 12, she'd insist they leave. At 7 minutes, she heard the mechanism give with a sound like a sigh, and Ronan pulled the drawer open. She came to stand beside him and held the lantern close while he went through the contents. The files were neat, labeled in Fitch's precise hand. Property names, dates, legal terms she partially understood. He moved through them quickly, not reading, scanning for the one they needed. He found it in a manila folder at the back of the drawer labeled simply Survey, N.E. Foothills, Private. He opened it on the floor. They both crouched over it. The document was 12 pages. The first page had a date, 8 years and 3 months ago, and a commission notation, CLR Company, Private Survey Commission, not for public filing. The assay projections were on pages 7 and 8, and she heard Ronan exhale slowly through his nose when he read them. She read them too. The silver deposit under the Mercer claim was not modest. It was not the kind of thing you might overlook or misassess. The survey estimated recoverable ore at a value that made the numbers she'd been struggling with, $60, $90, $4.30, feel like something from a different world entirely. "He's known for 8 years, she said, very quietly. "Yes." She turned to page 9. There was a handwritten memo, Fitch's hand, attached with a pin to the survey pages. It was dated 3 months before Thomas died. It read, "SC instructs that the M debt be accelerated per standard clause. Survey not to be disclosed. If M resists transfer, escalate through legal process. Do not involve direct action. Use process only. Do not involve direct action." She stared at that line. "What does that mean?" she said, though some part of her already knew. "It means," Ronan said carefully, "that at the time this memo was written, Crow was telling Fitch to keep everything legal. Use the debt. Use the courts." He paused. "What happened to the number 4 happened after this, which means either Crow changed his mind about direct action, or someone acted without this particular instruction being updated. Or Fitch doesn't know everything," she said, "or that." She looked at the document in her hands. 12 pages. The legal term for what this represented, concealed survey, manufactured debt, possible connection to a fatal structural failure, She didn't know the exact words, but she knew the shape of it. This was the shape of a man who had decided that his desire for something outweighed the lives of the people who stood between him and it. She also knew with cold clarity that holding this document made her considerably more dangerous to Silas Crow than she had been this morning. "We can't take it," she said. Ronan looked at her. "If it goes missing, he knows someone was here and he knows we have it," she said. "He'll move immediately. He won't wait for the legal deadline. He'll use Drury and Keene and it won't be sitting on a fence anymore." He was quiet, looking at the document. "We copy what we need," she said. "The date, the commission notation, the assay figures, the memo, word for word. You write it, your handwriting's steadier than mine right now." She was not ashamed to admit it. "We put the original back exactly as we found it. Then we have what we know without him knowing we know it." He looked at her for a moment with that recalibrating expression again. "That's right," he said. "I know it's right," she said. "Do you have paper?" He did. He had paper and a pencil in the tool roll, because she was beginning to understand, a man who thought about what he might need before he needed it. He copied the relevant sections while she held the lantern, his handwriting small and precise, and she watched the door and the window and the time. They were out of the building 18 minutes after they'd entered. The window latched behind them. The alley was empty. From 2 blocks away, the saloon provided its continuous ambient noise. They walked to the horses and rode out of town at a pace that was not hurrying because hurrying was visible. It wasn't until they were on the road past the edge of town, with the lights of Caldwell Creek behind them and the mountains dark against the stars ahead, that she let out the breath she'd apparently been holding for the last 20 minutes. "You all right?" he said. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true, and because lying about the state of her hand seemed pointless, "My hands are shaking." "That's normal." "Is it?" "Happens after," he said, "when the thing you are managing to not feel catches up." They rode in silence for a while. The road was pale in the darkness, the dust of it visible even without moon, and the air had finally lost the worst of the day's heat and become something you could breathe without effort. "We have 7 days," she said, "and we have the survey and the memo and Thomas's note and Tom Ashby's account and the stakes in the hills." "It's enough to take somewhere," he said. "It's enough to make a case to a federal authority. Land fraud, at minimum. The connection to the number 4, that's harder, but the fraud alone is enough to freeze the claim process." "Who do we take it to?" "There's a federal land office in Glenwood," he said. "Marshal's office, too. I know a deputy marshal out of there, a man named Coburn. He's honest, which in this territory is a specific virtue worth naming." "How long to get there?" "Hard ride. 2 days there, 2 back." He paused. "Through the mountain pass. Not easy in this heat, but doable. 4 days there and back. 3 days remaining before the deadline." She did the arithmetic. "We'd have to leave in 5 days," she said, "to get back with anything actionable before the deadline." "Yes. That means we have 5 days to build this as solid as we can before we move." She thought about it. Tom Ashby's statement. Written, signed, witnessed. Martha Colby. She might know what documents have been moving through the land office if Jim is willing to let her say so. And we need someone in town who knows law, not Fitch, someone else. There's a man named Garrett who does land transactions on the side. He's not a proper lawyer, but he knows enough to recognize what we have. Can he be trusted? "He doesn't like Crow," Ronan said. "That's not the same thing as trustworthy, but it's a starting point." "It'll do," she said. They reached the turnoff to her property. He pulled up alongside her and they sat there for a moment in the dark, with the road forking in front of them. "Ronan," she said. He looked at her. "Thank you for not looking away in that store." She said it simply because it was simple, not elaborate, not dramatic, just true. Most people look away. He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet about things that mattered to him. "Go get some sleep," he said. "You've got 5 days of work ahead of you." She almost smiled. "Good night." She turned her horse up the road toward the dark house, and behind her she heard him ride toward town, and the night settled around her with all its heat and weight, and the particular silence of a place where very large things were beginning to move. The 5 days moved the way 5 days move, when every hour inside them matters. Not fast, not slow, but with a particular density, each one pressing down on the next like stones stacked on a chest. Tom Ashby gave his statement on the second day. He sat in the back room of his smithy with the doors closed and the forge banked low. A big, soot-darkened man with hands that could bend iron and a face that looked like it had been carrying something heavy for a while. And he told what Thomas had brought him and what he'd seen in that timber, and what he'd told Thomas to do about it. Ronan wrote it down word for word while Lydia sat across the table from Tom and watched him work through the discomfort of saying out loud what he'd been turning over privately for 3 months. I should have pushed him harder, Tom said. He wasn't looking at either of them. He was looking at the floor. When he came to me with that timber, I should have said, "Go today, Tom, not eventually. Today." You told him what you saw, Lydia said. You told him to report it. And then I went back to my forge and figured it was his business to deal with. He finally looked up at her. I'm sorry, Mrs. Mercer. For what it's worth from me, I'm real sorry. It was worth something. She could see it cost him to say it, and she received it accordingly. Sign it, she said, and pushed the paper toward him. He signed. Ronan witnessed it. They rolled it and put it with the copied survey notes and Thomas's original letter from the ledger, the one that said, "Destroy this," and the copies they'd made of the assay projections and the memo in Fitch's hand. Garrett, the part-time landman, looked at their assembled papers on the evening of the third day and said, "Lord Almighty," and then caught himself and said, "This is a federal land fraud case, plain as daylight. The survey concealment alone, that's criminal under the Mining Acts of '72. The memo about accelerating the debt while suppressing the survey, that's compounding it." He tapped the copy of the assay projection. "And if you can connect any of this to what happened in that mine shaft, we have Tom Ashby's statement," Ronan said. "Tom Ashby saying he saw a suspicious timber 3 weeks before the collapse," Garrett said. "That's a start. That's not a finish." He looked at Lydia. "A federal marshal is your best option. Get this in front of someone with actual authority to freeze the claim process while an investigation opens. Once there's an active federal investigation, Fitch can't file his lien. The deadline becomes irrelevant." "Glenwood," Ronan said. "Coburn," Garrett confirmed. He knew the name. "If Coburn's there, yes, he's the right man." They left on the 5th day, before dawn, which was Ronan's call, and she didn't argue it. Leaving before the sun came up meant leaving before Drury and Keene were on the South Road, which they had been every morning with the mechanical reliability of men being paid to be present. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Lydia and Ronan were already 3 miles out of town on the mountain trail heading northwest, their horses picking their way in the gray pre-dawn light through terrain that rewarded attention and punished inattention in about equal measure. She had the documents in an oilskin pouch inside her coat against her body. Ronan had a copy. He'd made one that last evening, same handwriting, same information, rolled and tied and tucked in his saddlebag. 2 copies in 2 different places, which was his idea and the right one. The trail into the mountains was not the kind of thing you'd call a road. It was a path, maintained by use rather than intention, that wound up through the foothills and then into the timber and then above the timber into the high passes before dropping down the other side toward the valley where Glenwood sat. In good weather, with horses that knew mountain terrain, it was manageable. In the heat of late July, with horses that were already working harder than they should have been in this temperature, it required patience. They stopped twice in the first morning to water the horses at creek crossings. The water level was low everywhere. The drought had hit the mountain creeks too, not as severely as the valley below, but noticeably. At the second crossing, Lydia got down and cupped water to her face and let it run down her neck and stood for a moment with the cold of it against her skin and the sound of it moving over rocks and felt, briefly, something approaching ordinary. "How well do you know this pass?" she said. Ronan was checking his horse's left front foot, which had been favoring slightly on the rocky sections. "Well enough. Came through it a few times, trapping, years back. Once in October, when I shouldn't have." "What happened in October?" "Snow came in faster than I'd read the weather." He set the foot down, apparently satisfied. "Spent 2 days in a rock shelter eating jerked venison and reconsidering my decision-making." "Did it work? The reconsidering?" "Somewhat," he said, and there was something dry in it that was as close as he got to humor, and she found she'd been paying enough attention to him in the last 10 days to recognize it. They mounted and kept moving. The trail steepened in the early afternoon, climbing into the first of the high switchbacks where the timber thinned and the rock came through and the view opened up behind them. The valley below, Caldwell Creek, a faint smudge of buildings and dust in the distance. The whole of it looking small and precarious from up here, the way human settlements always look from elevation, like something that could be erased by the landscape without the landscape particularly noticing. She looked at it for a moment when they stopped to rest the horses on a flat outcrop. "You think he knows we're gone yet?" she said. "Drury would have noticed by mid-morning," Ronan said. "Reported to Crow by noon." He looked out over the valley. "Question is whether Crow figures out where we're going. If he figures it out, he'll send someone after us." He said it matter-of-factly, not trying to dress it up. The pass is the obvious route to Glenwood. There's a southern route, but it adds a full day. So if he sends men, they're a morning behind us. Maybe less if they start fast. He looked at her. "We don't stop for the night longer than we have to." She nodded. She was already tired. Not broken, but the kind of tired that accumulates when you've been running on anger and not much sleep and just enough food for 10 days. And she pushed it to the background the way she'd been pushing things to the background and kept her eyes on the trail ahead. They pushed higher through the afternoon. The heat eased somewhat with elevation, but the sun was still punishing on the exposed sections, and the horses were blowing harder on the steeper grades. Ronan set a pace that was efficient rather than aggressive, covering ground without burning the animals, which was the kind of calculation that came from experience rather than theory. She matched it without comment. It was near 4 in the afternoon, just past the first high saddle and into the timber on the far side, when he pulled up suddenly and held up a hand. She stopped. The trees here were old growth, massive ponderosas, the kind that had been growing for 100 years and had the indifference to human activity that comes with being around long enough. The trail ran through them in a near straight line for about a quarter mile before bending left around a granite outcrop. "What?" she said quietly. He was looking back down the trail below them. His horse had its ears forward. "Maybe nothing," he said. She looked. Below them, through the trees, the trail switchbacked down, and she could see maybe 300 yards of it before it bent out of sight. Nothing moving. Or maybe not nothing, she said, because the horses' ears were still forward, and horses were not subtle about what they sensed. "Keep moving," he said. "Don't hurry." They moved. She fought the urge to look back constantly, and mostly won that fight, allowing herself one look every 5 minutes, which was as much discipline as she felt she could reasonably bring to the situation. On the third look, a quarter mile back down through the trees, she caught a movement that was not a deer and not the wind. "2 of them," she said. "I saw." He hadn't looked back. Keene would be the one Crow sent. He's smarter than Drury, and Crow would want someone with sense on this. "Can we outrun them?" "Not through this section. Terrain's too even." He was thinking she could see it. Not panicking, actually thinking, the methodical assessment of someone who has been in difficult terrain and figured his way out of it before. "There's a section about a mile ahead where the trail goes through a rock fall, 3-4 routes through it. If we take the right one and they don't know the terrain, you said you came through this pass before." "Twice. And they haven't." "Probably not." He glanced at her. "We'll need to move faster through the exposed section before the rock fall. Can your horse handle it?" "She'll handle it," Lydia said, and hoped she was right. They pushed the horses harder on the next section, the trail climbing steeply through a long open face where the timber had thinned to scattered stands and the rock showed through in long gray shelves. Behind them, she could hear nothing over the sound of the horses and the wind. That was the thing about being chased in open country. You couldn't hear what was gaining on you until it was already close. The rock fall was exactly as Ronan had described it. A massive old slide that had come down off the face above some time in the geological past and left a field of boulders the size of houses, through which the trail divided and subdivided into multiple threads, some dead-ending against walls of rock, some threading through to the far side. He went left without hesitating, taking a line that looked from the outside like it was going to dead end and then didn't, opening into a narrow passage between 2 house-sized boulders that angled right and then right again, and then spilled out onto a ledge trail on the far side of the field. They moved through it at a trot, the horses' hooves loud on the rock, the passage so narrow in 2 sections that her knee brushed stone. Then they were through, on the far side, in the timber again, and Ronan pulled up in a stand of trees where the trail bent behind a ridge. "Wait," he said quietly. They waited. From back in the rock fall, they could hear sound, hoofbeats, not moving fast, moving the way horses move when the riders aren't sure of the ground. A murmured exchange of voices, too far to make out words. Then silence. Then faintly, the sound of hoofbeats going in a different direction entirely. One of the other threads through the rock field, heading toward a dead end she couldn't see but could infer. Ronan let out a slow breath. That'll take them a while. How long? Getting in and out of a dead end in that field? Getting back to the fork? Finding the right line? He considered 20 minutes, maybe 30 if they go far before they realize. Then we move. We move, he agreed. They did. The trail on the far side of the rock fall descended for a mile, and then climbed again toward the main pass, and they made that section in hard, fast riding that she would feel in her legs for a week afterward, the mare finding her footing on instinct while Lydia focused on staying balanced and not grabbing leather when the trail got loose. By the time they reached the pass proper, a narrow notch between two peaks, the wind coming through it cold and sharp despite the season, the sun was getting low and the valley on the far side was already in shadow. Glenwood was down there somewhere, invisible in the early dark. They stopped at the top of the pass because the horses needed it, and because you didn't descend an unfamiliar mountain trail in the dark if you had a choice. "We're ahead of them," Ronan said. "If they find the right line through the rock field and keep pushing, they're maybe 40 minutes back. They won't risk the descent in full dark either. So we have until morning. Until early morning. They'll start moving when there's enough light." She looked at the trail descending into the dark valley below. "How long to Glenwood once we're down?" 2 hours on flat ground, maybe less. She looked at the sky where the stars were coming hard in the cold air at altitude. "How much light do we need to start the descent?" He looked at the trail. It was bad. Rocky, steep, the kind of thing that wanted your full attention in daylight and your prayers in the dark. "We'd need enough to see the footing," he said. "First gray light, maybe an hour before sunrise. And if Keene and whoever's with him starts at first gray light from where they are, they're behind the rock field still. They've got more ground." He was quiet for a moment. "We'd reach Glenwood before them. Probably." "Probably," she said. "I can't give you certainty on a mountain in the dark," he said, and it wasn't an apology, just a fact. "I know." She dismounted and started loosening the mare's girth because the horse had earned it and because she had to do something with her hands while she thought. "We rest until there's light. Keep the horses as fresh as we can for the descent. Go fast on the flat." "That's what I'd do," he said. They didn't make a fire. A fire at the pass was a signal visible for miles behind them, which defeated the purpose of being ahead. They ate jerked meat and hardtack from the saddlebags and sat with their backs against a boulder out of the wind. The horses hobbled nearby, the cold coming in from above while the last warmth of the day bled out of the rock beneath them. It was the first time in 10 days they'd sat still together with nothing immediate to plan or discuss, and it had a strange quality, that stillness, not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. She was aware of the closeness of him in the dark, and the warmth of it, which was purely physical, the warmth of another person's body in a cold place. But she was aware of it and let herself be aware of it without making it into something it wasn't. "How long have you been up here?" she said. "In the mountains, living the way you do." He thought about it. 7 years, roughly. "By choice?" "Mostly." He was quiet for a moment. "Had a situation in Missouri I needed some distance from. Came out here for a season, figured I'd go back. Didn't." She didn't press for the Missouri situation. People who lived alone in mountains generally had their reasons, and those reasons were their own business. "Do you like it?" she said instead. "Yeah," he said simply. "I like the quiet. I like knowing the things I know out here, the weather, the animals, the terrain. I like that it's honest. The mountain doesn't care what you think of yourself. It just shows you what you're actually made of." She thought about that. "Thomas would have liked you," she said. It came out before she decided to say it. He wasn't a man who said things he didn't mean either. Ronan was quiet for a moment. "He sounds like someone worth knowing." "He was," she said. "He was impractical and stubborn, and he held things too close, and he was worth knowing." She stopped there. It was enough. After a while, Ronan said, "You should sleep for a few hours. I'll watch." "You need sleep too." "I'll sleep after," he said. "I've gone longer than a night before." She didn't argue, partly because she was tired enough that arguing felt like spending something she needed to save. She pulled her coat tighter and settled against the boulder and was asleep in the time it takes a candle to go out. He woke her when the sky in the east had that particular shade of not quite black that comes just ahead of gray. She was up and on her feet in seconds, which she would not have been able to do 2 weeks ago. Exhaustion will do that, or threat will, or both together make something sharp in you that cuts the transition from sleep to ready very short. They saddled in the dark and started down. The descent was everything you'd expect from a mountain trail before full light. Slow, technical, the horses picking their way more by feel than sight on the steepest sections, Lydia keeping her weight back and trusting the mare in the places she couldn't see clearly. Ronan went first on the worst sections to test the footing, not because she couldn't handle it, but because he'd been on this trail before and she hadn't, and that was the practical reason, and they both knew it. 3/4 of the way down, with the light coming fast now, and the valley visible below, she heard it. Faint, a mile above them, the sound of hoofbeats on rock. "They started early," she said. "Move," he said. The last 1/4 mile of the descent was faster than was entirely wise, and she knew it and did it anyway. The mare blowing hard. The footing becoming better as they hit the lower slope, and the rock gave way to packed dirt and then to flat ground. And then they were on the valley floor in the early gray light with Glenwood visible ahead. A real town, bigger than Caldwell Creek, smoke from morning fires already rising. She let the mare run. Ronan came alongside her, and they rode the 2 miles to the edge of town at a pace that turned heads among the few people already out in the early morning, 2 hard-ridden horses and 2 dust-covered riders coming in like something was behind them, which it was. The marshal's office was on the main street, a solid adobe building with a federal seal on the door. Ronan knew where it was, went straight to it. A deputy was on the step with a coffee cup, young, just starting his morning. "Coburn," Ronan said, pulling up. "Deputy Marshal Coburn. Is he here?" The young deputy looked at them both with the measured assessment of someone learning to read situations. "He's inside. Who's asking?" "Ronan Hale and Lydia Mercer," Ronan said, "out of Caldwell Creek. We have documented evidence of federal land fraud, concealed survey, and potential connection to an industrial death. We have 2 men from the party we're bringing evidence against approximately 40 minutes behind us on the mountain trail." He looked at the deputy. "I'd like to speak to Coburn now, please." The deputy looked at Lydia. She held his gaze and didn't say anything because Ronan had said everything that needed saying. The deputy went inside. He was back in 30 seconds. "Come in," he said. Deputy Marshal Coburn was a compact man in his 40s, gray at the temples, with the look of someone who had learned a long time ago not to be impressed by urgency until he determined whether it was genuine. He had a cup of coffee too, and he kept it in his hand when they came in, not offering any, not being rude, just keeping his hands occupied while he listened. Lydia put the oilskin pouch on his desk and opened it herself. She laid the documents out in order. The copied survey, the assay projections, the memo, Thomas's note, Tom Ashby's signed statement, and then she stood back and let him look. He looked for a long time. He picked up the memo copy, read it twice, put it down, picked up Tom Ashby's statement. "This is a copy of the survey document," he said, "not the original. The original is in a locked file in the office of the attorney Fitch in Caldwell Creek," Ronan said. "We didn't remove it. We copied the relevant sections." Coburn looked at him. There was a question in the look about how exactly they had access to the contents of a locked file without removing anything, and he clearly decided not to ask it yet. "The commission notation on the survey," Coburn said, "CLR Crow Land and Resource." "Yes, and the date predates any formal connection between the Crow Company and the Mercer claim by how long?" 2 years, Lydia said. The debt arrangement that gave Crow any formal interest in the property was established 2 years after this survey was commissioned. He knew what was under that land before he had any legitimate reason to be involved with it. Coburn set down the paper. He looked at Lydia for a moment with the direct, assessing look of a man who deals in facts and has learned to read people against them. "Mrs. Mercer," he said, "I'm going to ask you a straight question, and I'd like a straight answer." "All right." Are you certain this evidence is what you believe it to be? Because if I open a federal investigation based on documents you've brought me, and it turns out they're not what you say, the commission notation is a coincidence, the dates don't hold up under scrutiny. I'm certain, she said. I've had 5 days to be uncertain about it, and I'm still certain. He held her eyes for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup and called toward the back room. Jensen, get Torres and come in here. He looked at Ronan. You said 2 men behind you on the trail. Approximately 40 minutes when we rode in, Ronan said. Closer now. What are their names? Keen and probably one other. They work for Crow. They'll be coming into town, Coburn said. Let them come. I want to know who rides in from the East Trail in the next hour. He said this to Jensen, who had appeared in the doorway with another man behind him. Jensen nodded and went out. Coburn looked back at the documents on his desk. He picked up the memo again and read it a third time, and this time something settled in his face. Not quite anger, but the particular expression of a man who has seen enough of a certain kind of wrongdoing to recognize it immediately and has a very specific response to it. I'm going to need the original survey document, he said. That means I'm sending Torres to Caldwell Creek with a federal warrant to seize the contents of that file. The deadline on the debt, Lydia said. Fitch is set to file for lien foreclosure in, she counted, 4 days. A federal warrant for investigation of land fraud freezes all associated claim actions, Coburn said. Fitch can't file anything while there's an active federal proceeding. He looked at her steadily. Your land stays yours while we investigate, Mrs. Mercer. That I can promise you. She had been holding herself together for 10 days with something that was partly anger and partly necessity, and that sentence, your land stays yours, hit a place underneath those things that she hadn't been able to get to, and for a moment the room wavered slightly, and she put one hand on the edge of his desk. Ronan was beside her before she'd made a decision about whether she needed him to be, not grabbing her, just present, close enough that she could feel the solidity of him. I'm fine, she said. I know, he said. He didn't move away. She steadied herself and straightened and took her hand off the desk. There are people in Caldwell Creek who are going to need protection, she said. Tom Ashby gave us a statement, and he's known to have given it. Martha Colby and her husband, Garrett, who looked at these documents. Torres will carry letters to the county sheriff when he goes, Coburn said, requesting local protection for witnesses named in the investigation. I can do that today. He paused. You're going back. It wasn't a question. Yes, she said. Coburn looked at her for a moment with an expression that was, she thought, something like respect. Not the kind you perform, but the kind you can't entirely keep off your face. I'll have Torres on the road to Caldwell Creek by this afternoon, he said. I'll follow within 2 days with a full inquiry team. He picked up the documents and began to organize them with the careful attention of a man who understands what they represent. You've done good work here, Mrs. Mercer. I've done necessary work, she said. That's different. She gathered the oilskin pouch, empty now, the documents in Coburn's hands where they needed to be. She looked at Ronan. He looked back at her, and the understanding between them was simple and complete and required no words. They were going home, and what was waiting for them there was not over, and they both knew it. They walked out into the morning. The sun was fully up now, the valley bright and sharp in the early light. Their horses were at the hitching post, heads down, both of them wearing the particular posture of animals that have given everything they had and are now deeply interested in standing still. They're going to need a day's rest before we can push them again, Ronan said. Then we rest them a day, Lydia said. She looked east toward the mountains they'd come through, the pass invisible from here, just the high dark line of the peaks against the blue. Somewhere up in those peaks, Keene and his partner were either still threading through the rock fall or had made it down and were somewhere in this town. And either way, what they'd come to stop had already happened. The documents were in a federal marshal's hands. The warrant was being written. She breathed in the morning air, which smelled of pine and horse, and the particular smell of a town waking up, which was not so different from any other town waking up, and felt something she hadn't felt since the morning before Thomas died, when she'd woken up early and made coffee and stood on the step in the cool air, watching the light come over the mountain. She felt like the ground under her was solid, not safe, not certain, but solid. It would have to be enough, because there was still Caldwell Creek to go back to. and Silas Crow was still there, and the fight wasn't finished. The investigation would do what it could do, but Crow had been building his position in that valley for 8 years, and a federal warrant was not the same thing as a verdict. And Lydia Mercer had lived long enough to understand that justice was not something that happened to you. It was something you had to go back and make happen. So she checked the mayor's feet and refilled the water canteen from the trough outside the marshal's office and let herself feel the solidity of the ground under her for exactly as long as she could afford to. Then she started thinking about what came next. They rode back through the pass on the third morning, when the horses had recovered enough to make the climb without breaking them. The return was quieter than the ride out. No sound behind them on the trail, no movement in the rock field, just the mountain doing what mountains do, indifferent and enormous and unchanged by whatever small human urgency had moved through it 2 days prior. Keen and his partner had apparently come into Glenwood, assessed the situation, and left without incident. Jensen had reported 2 men matching the description arriving in town the morning of their first day there, asking questions at the hotel and the livery, and departing by noon. What they'd reported back to Crow, and what Crow had done with that report, was something Lydia turned over in her mind for most of the return ride. Crow was not a man who panicked. That was the thing about him that made him genuinely dangerous, more dangerous than a man who acted out of anger or fear. He was a man who calculated, who looked at a changed situation and figured out what the new available moves were. He would know by now that they'd reached Glenwood. He would know, or strongly suspect, that they'd gone to the marshal. He'd have 2 days before Torres arrived with the federal warrant, and a man like Crow would know exactly how to use 2 days. He'll try to move the original survey document, she said, somewhere above the rock field on the descent into the valley, before Torres gets there with the warrant. I've been thinking the same thing, Ronan said. Can he? Fitch has the document. Fitch is a lawyer who's deep into something that is now a federal matter. Whether Fitch does what Crow tells him when there's a federal warrant coming, he paused. That depends on how much spine Fitch has and whether he's figured out that Crow will let him take the fall if it comes to that. Lawyers like Fitch don't take falls for other people, she said. They're constitutionally opposed to it. Then maybe the document stays where it is. Maybe, she said, but I'm not riding back into Caldwell Creek and waiting to find out. He glanced at her. What are you thinking? She'd been thinking about it for 2 days, between the sleep and the meals and the long stretches of trail where thinking was the only thing to do. She'd thought about Coburn's warrant and Torres riding in with federal authority and what happened in the hours between Torres's arrival and Crow's response. And she'd thought about Fitch and what a lawyer does when the ground shifts under him. And she'd thought about the people in Caldwell Creek who knew things and had been afraid to say them. I'm thinking, she said, that a federal warrant is a piece of paper. And Crow has been in that town for 8 years, and everyone in it owes him something or fears him something. A piece of paper doesn't change that by itself. What changes it? Ronan said. People, she said. People saying out loud what they know. He was quiet for a moment, riding. That's a harder thing to make happen than a warrant. I know, she said, but I've got something Coburn doesn't have. I'm one of them. I live there. I buried my husband there. She looked at the valley below, coming visible now through the thinning trees, the flat brown of it under the August heat. There are people in that town who've been watching Crow do what he does for years and swallowing it. Tom Ashby swallowed it for 3 months and it sat badly on him. He's not the only one. Ronan didn't argue with her. He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to expect from him. He didn't dismiss things because they were inconvenient, and he didn't agree with things just to be agreeable. It's risky, he said. If you go at Crow publicly before Torres arrives with the warrant, he has options, legal options, and the other kind. I know. Drury and Keene are 2 men in a town full of people who are tired, she said. Tired people are different from afraid people. They look similar from the outside, but they're not the same. He let out a slow breath. When do you want to do it? Tomorrow morning, she said. Torres should be arriving in Caldwell Creek sometime tomorrow. If I move before he gets there, I draw Crow's attention to me and away from Fitch's office. Crow focuses on shutting me down publicly. While he's doing that, Torres walks in with the warrant. Ronan was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough that she thought he might actually object, actually tell her it was too dangerous or too uncertain, or some reasonable variation of the things she'd already told herself. Instead, he said, "Then we ride straight through. No stopping in town tonight. Straight to your place, rest a few hours. Go in the morning." "Yes," she said. They rode straight through. Caldwell Creek. At dusk looked exactly the way it had looked every evening she'd lived there. The light going orange on the storefronts, the saloon already audible, the smell of dust and horse and someone's supper fire. She registered all of it with the particular attention of someone who has been away briefly and come back changed, where the familiar looks both the same and different because you are not the same person who left. Nobody on the street marked their arrival, or if they did, they didn't show it. She rode through without stopping, out to the property, unsaddled the mare, fed her properly, checked her feet again. Ronan saw to his horse at the post and came inside, and they ate what was left in the kitchen without much conversation, and she was asleep by 8 o'clock. She woke at 5 with the particular clarity of someone who has already decided what the day is going to be. She dressed carefully. Not in her best. She didn't have a best anymore. Thomas's death and the 2 months since had reduced her wardrobe to functional. But in the cleanest things she had, the dark skirt and the gray blouse that buttoned to the throat. She braided her hair and pinned it. She looked at herself in the piece of mirror above the washstand and thought that she looked like what she was. A woman in her 30s who had been through a hard season and was still on her feet. That would do. Ronan was at the kitchen table when she came out. He had coffee on, which he must have made quietly enough not to wake her, and he handed her a cup without preamble. "You should stay back," she said. "When I go to the square, stay where you can see, but don't be next to me." He frowned. "Why?" "Because if Drury or Keene make a move toward me and you're standing beside me, it becomes a thing between men, and the town watches that differently than they watch a woman standing alone." She held his gaze. "I need them to see me alone. It means something different." He didn't like it. She could see that plainly. But he thought about it for a moment and said, "All right, I'll be at the hardware side of the square." "If something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong," he said, with a certainty she recognized as not quite genuine, the kind of certainty you express because the alternative is not useful. "If something goes wrong," she repeated, "get to Torres. He should be coming in from the South Road by mid-morning." He looked at her across the table for a moment. There was something in his face she didn't have a name for exactly. Not worry, or not only worry. Something that was worry and something else. Something that had been building quietly in the last 10 days, the way things build when two people are in close proximity to danger together and have to trust each other with things that matter. She didn't name it. She drank her coffee. They rode into town at 8:30. Main Street was alive with its normal morning business. The smithy smoke already rising, the women outside the dry goods exchanging the morning's information, 2 ranch hands loading a wagon outside the feed store. Normal. Ordinary. The specific texture of a morning in a small western town in the summer of 1883 that had been the texture of every morning here for years. She rode to the center of town and dismounted at the post in front of the land office, and tied the mare and stood there for a moment, and then she raised her voice and said, "I need to speak to this town. Anyone who'll listen." It was not a dramatic announcement. She said it in the same tone she'd used to say it was going to rain, because she'd decided that dramatics were not the register she wanted. Dramatics could be dismissed. A woman standing in the middle of the street in a clean gray blouse, speaking in a level voice, was harder to dismiss. A few people looked, then a few more. The nature of small towns being what it is, the looking attracted more looking, and within 3 minutes there were 15 people on or near the street paying attention, with more drifting closer from the edges. She saw, at the far end of the street, Drury. He was standing still, watching her with his flat, worn-down expression. She didn't see Keene. She didn't see Crow yet either. "My name is Lydia Mercer," she said, loud enough to carry without shouting. "My husband Thomas died in the number 4 collapse in February. Most of you know that. Most of you came to the service." She paused. "What you don't know, what I didn't know until recently, is why he died." That got the remaining conversations to stop. The silence that fell on Main Street was the particular silence of people who have been waiting, without knowing they were waiting, for someone to say the thing that has been present in the room for months. "Silas Crow commissioned a private survey of my land 8 years ago," she said, "before Thomas and I ever arrived here, before we bought the claim. The survey found a significant silver deposit, substantial enough that the land's actual value is far beyond anything we were ever told it was worth. Crow knew. He's known for 8 years. He manufactured our debt, structured the terms of the equipment loan so Thomas could never stay current, used the debt as a legal mechanism to take the land without appearing to steal it. From the edge of the crowd, she saw Martha Colby, her hands folded in front of her, her face very still. Jim Colby was beside her, and he was looking at the ground, and then he looked up and met Lydia's eyes and didn't look away. 3 weeks before the number 4 collapsed, she continued, Thomas brought a support timber to Tom Ashby's smithy. The timber had been cut partway through on the interior face. Thomas was going to report it to the mine inspector. The mine inspector was Aldous Price, who has been in this town this week playing cards with Crow's lawyer. She heard the sound of a door. She didn't look, but she felt it. Felt the change in the attention of the crowd, the slight collective shift of eyes going somewhere behind her and above. Crow had come out of somewhere. She could tell by the crowd's reaction without having to see him. She kept going. I have documented evidence of the concealed survey. I have a signed statement from Tom Ashby about the timber. I have a note from someone who tried to warn Thomas that Crow had already surveyed the land. Yesterday morning, I delivered copies of this evidence to Deputy Marshal Coburn in Glenwood. A federal warrant for investigation is on its way to this town today. The silence was different now. Not the held-breath silence of people waiting for something to happen. The dense, charged silence of people who are processing information that changes the shape of something they thought they understood. Mrs. Mercer, Crow's voice, behind her and to the right. Pleasant, measured. The voice of a man who has been in difficult situations before and knows that the way you enter them matters. I think perhaps you've had a very difficult few months and— Don't, she said. She turned to face him. He was on the wooden sidewalk in front of the land office, in his good wool despite the heat, keen visible at the edge of her periphery. Don't do that. Don't speak to me like I'm a woman who's confused about what she knows. A murmur in the crowd. Small, but there. Crow's expression didn't change. What you're describing is a very serious accusation, the kind that carries consequences when it can't be substantiated. The survey is in Fitch's bottom drawer, she said, in a manila folder marked private. The warrant will find it today. Something moved behind Crow's eyes. Very brief, very controlled, but she saw it. The specific reaction of a man who has just been told that someone knows exactly where something is, which raises a question about how they know. Even if such a survey exists, Crow said, and his voice had gone slightly more careful, the pleasantness fractionally reduced. A private survey of land in this territory is hardly evidence of— Silas, the voice came from the middle of the crowd. Quiet, but it carried. Everyone looked. Lydia looked. It was Jim Colby. He was standing with his hat in his hands, his eyes on Crow, his face doing the work that faces do when a man is afraid and going ahead anyway. Jim, Martha said low. I work in the land office, Jim said to the assembled street. He wasn't speaking loudly. He didn't need to. I've been processing documents for the last 6 weeks, property liens, claim transfers, debt filings, most of them connected to properties that adjoin or overlap the Mercer claim. He paused. I kept telling myself it was legal process, which it is. The process itself is legal. He looked at Lydia. But I've known for a while that something wasn't right about the shape of it, about why those particular properties were moving through at that particular rate. Crow said, Jim Colby, you work for the county and I'd be careful about— I've been careful for 6 years, Jim said, and his voice had something in it that sounded like a man putting down something heavy. I don't think I want to keep being careful about this particular thing. The crowd shifted, not dramatically. Nobody moved or spoke, but the weight of it redistributed, the way weight redistributes when the ground underneath changes. What happened next happened the way things happen in a place where the pressure has been building for long enough that the release, once it starts, doesn't stop with one voice. Eleanor Voss, who ran the boarding house on 3rd Street, and whose late husband had owned a mining claim that Crow's company had acquired 4 years ago under circumstances that had always troubled her, said, he bought August's claim for 1/4 of what it was worth, and we all knew it, and nobody said anything. Then Pete Delacroix, one of the brothers, said, he holds paper on our cattle operation, modified the terms twice without sending proper notice. I've got the original contract. Then a man Lydia didn't know well, a smaller rancher from the north end of the valley named Harker, said, "He told me the water rights on my upper pasture were invalid under the county filing. I hired a lawyer from Pueblo last year who told me they were completely valid. By then I'd already paid Crow's company for access to water that was mine to begin with." Each voice was quieter than the one before it, because each one cost something to say. Years of swallowed anger, years of small calculated submissions to a man whose leverage was so woven into the fabric of daily life that it was hard to see where the fabric ended and the leverage began. Each voice came out anyway. Crow stood on the sidewalk and said nothing. His expression had gone to the careful blankness of a man who is doing rapid accounting, figuring out what has already been said and what it means and whether there are moves remaining. Drury had stepped back. She noticed that. He'd been at the far end of the street and now he was further at the far end, and the mathematics of being a man paid to intimidate people, when the people are no longer intimidatable, had clearly been recalculated. Keene was gone entirely. She'd lost him in the periphery somewhere. Lydia looked at Crow directly. He looked back at her. He was still composed. The composure was remarkable, actually, the thing he'd built over 8 years of controlling this place through patience and calculation rather than violence. And it held even now because it was structural, the composure of a man who believed he still had moves. "The federal investigation will determine what happened," she said. Not triumphant. She was too tired for triumphant, and too smart for it anyway. "That's not up to me or you anymore." "No," he said. His voice was very controlled. "I suppose it isn't." They looked at each other for a moment across the space of Main Street with the town all around them. And then she heard it. Hoofbeats coming from the south, 2 horses moving at a deliberate pace, the kind of pace that federal authority moves at when it has a warrant and isn't rushing because it doesn't need to. Torres came around the bend at the south end of Main Street with another deputy beside him, both of them in the dark coats of federal officers, and they rode to the center of town, and Torres looked at the assembled crowd and at Lydia and at Crow and said, "I'm looking for an attorney named Fitch and a Mr. Silas Crow." Crow said, "I'm Crow." Torres reached into his coat and produced a folded document. "Federal warrant for investigation of land fraud and related offenses. I'm going to need to ask you some questions, Mr. Crow, and I'm going to need to secure certain documents from the office of your attorney." He looked at the warrant and then at Crow. "You're requested to remain in town pending the arrival of Deputy Marshal Coburn, who will be here within 2 days." Crow took the warrant. He opened it. He read it with the careful attention of a man who reads legal documents as a matter of professional habit. And while he read it, the crowd watched him, and Lydia watched him. And when he finished, he folded it and held it, and looked at Lydia with an expression she had never seen on his face before and couldn't fully name. Not quite defeat, not quite recognition, something in between. From across the square, she found Ronan at the hardware side, where he'd said he'd be. He was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching. When she found him, he didn't nod or make any gesture. He just looked at her steadily, the way he'd looked at her the first night in her kitchen. That particular attention that felt like being actually seen rather than observed. She held it for a moment. Then she looked back at the square, at Jim Colby still holding his hat, at Eleanor Voss with her hands at her sides and her chin up, at Pete Delacroix, at Harker, at Torres with the warrant, at the whole ordinary, extraordinary scene of a town finding its voice on a Tuesday morning in August. And she felt the grief and the anger and the exhaustion and the particular relief of a thing that has been held very tightly for a very long time being set down. Crow was saying something to Torres in a low voice, the lawyer's instinct kicking in, cooperative and controlled and already calculating the presentation. Torres was listening with the expression of a man who has heard this presentation before and will let it conclude before doing exactly what he came to do anyway. Fitch appeared from the east end of the street, called out by someone or drawn by some instinct for self-preservation that had apparently identified this as the moment to be present and cooperative rather than absent and suspect. He looked at the crowd and at Torres and at Crow with the expression of a man watching the ground dissolve under his feet and already performing the mental arithmetic of which direction to step. The town went on around all of it. Tom Ashby appeared in the door of his smithy, watching. Emmett Halbrook was on the sidewalk outside the store with a broom he wasn't using. Mrs. Hallett's curtain on the second floor of the boarding house moved. All the small watching and noting that small towns do, the machinery of community attention that had for years been running in Crow's service, cataloging the right people and reporting the right information to the right ears, was still running, was still watching. It was just watching something different now. Something had shifted in the architecture of this place. Not fixed, not finished, but shifted, the way a door shifts when someone finally turns the key. Lydia walked across the square to where Torres was standing. "I'm Lydia Mercer," she said. "I'm the one who brought the evidence to Marshal Coburn." Torres looked at her with the brief, direct assessment of a man who had been told about her. "I know who you are, Mrs. Mercer," he said. "Coburn sends his regards. He said you made a hard ride." "I had help," she said. She didn't look at Ronan when she said it. She didn't need to. The investigation took 4 months. That was the first thing that surprised people who had expected justice to move the way drama moves. Fast, clean, final. It didn't. It moved the way large institutional machinery moves, which is to say slowly, with setbacks, with moments where the whole thing seemed to stall and then lurched forward again with the grinding sound of something that was always going to get where it was going but wasn't going to be rushed about it. Coburn arrived 2 days after Torres, as promised, with 3 more deputies and a federal land examiner named Park, who wore spectacles and spoke very little and turned out to be the most dangerous person in the room in any proceeding he attended because he understood numbers and documents the way some people understand weather. Not just what they said, but what they meant, what they were constructed to conceal, what the gaps between them implied. Park spent a week in Fitch's office. He spent another week at the county land office with Jim Colby, who had apparently decided that the cost of continued silence was now higher than the cost of cooperation, and had laid everything he had in front of the federal examiner with the exhausted relief of someone finally setting down a weight they'd been carrying too long and without enough acknowledgement. Fitch cooperated fully on the 3rd day, which surprised no one who'd been paying attention to him. He was a lawyer who had convinced himself he was managing a real estate arrangement and had spent 2 years carefully not looking directly at the things that would have told him he was managing something considerably worse. When the federal warrant arrived and the scope of what was coming became apparent, he sat down with Torres and said he would answer every question completely and honestly. And then he did, for 3 days, in the particular exhaustive way of a man who has been living with a secret that has become too heavy and is genuinely relieved to put it down, regardless of what putting it down costs him. What Fitch knew and told was more than they'd had. He knew about the survey, had known since he'd been hired, had filed it in that bottom drawer with the better lock, because Crow had told him it was proprietary competitive intelligence, and that was the framing Fitch had chosen to accept. He knew about the debt structure, had written the terms himself, had understood what they were designed to do, had told himself that aggressive lending terms were legal and that the Mercer family's ability to service them was their own responsibility. He knew about Price, who had received payments from a Crow-connected account twice in the 18 months before the inspection. Payments Fitch had processed and described in the ledger as consulting fees, which they weren't. What Fitch didn't know, what he said he didn't know, with a specificity that convinced Coburn he was being truthful, was about the timber. He hadn't known about anyone going into the number 4 before the collapse. He hadn't known about the cut support. His memo about not involving direct action had been genuine instruction, and what happened to the number 4 had happened without his knowledge, which meant it had happened outside the channel he represented, which meant Crow had another channel that took 6 more weeks to find. It was Park who found it, in a set of accounts that ran through a shell company registered in Nevada, accounts that had made 3 payments to a man named Calvin Reese, who had worked briefly as a contract laborer for the number 4 in the months before the collapse and had left the area the week after it happened and had been in El Paso since then, working at a livery. A deputy marshal out of El Paso brought Reese back to Colorado in October. He was 26 years old and had the look of someone who had not slept properly in 8 months, which was approximately how long he'd been carrying the knowledge of what he'd done and why he'd done it, and what it had cost people who hadn't deserved it. He confessed in 2 hours. He'd been paid $40 to weaken 3 support timbers on the interior face of the main shaft. He'd been told it would cause a minor collapse that would close the shaft and give Crow's company legal grounds to call the equipment debt as an operational failure. He had not been told, or had told himself he hadn't understood, that men would die. When Men died, he'd taken his $40 and left and had been living with it in El Paso at the livery, sleeping badly and drinking more than he should, and trying not to think about the 3 names that had been in the newspaper report he'd read 6 times because he couldn't make himself stop reading it. Lydia was not in the room when Reese confessed. Coburn offered, and she declined. She knew she would want to be in the room, wanted to look at the man who had put a saw to a timber that killed Thomas, wanted to hear him say it in her presence. And she understood that wanting this and it being good for her were different questions. So she sat on the bench outside the marshal's temporary office in Caldwell Creek, which Coburn had requisitioned for the duration, and she waited. And when Coburn came out and sat beside her and told her what Reese had said, she listened to every word and then sat with it for a while. $40, she said. Yes. She breathed in through her nose and out slowly. Thomas's life was worth $40 to someone. Thomas's life wasn't worth anything to Crow, Coburn said. He wasn't trying to soften it. She appreciated that. That's not better, I know. But it's accurate. You weren't a person to him. You were an obstacle. The $40 was the cheapest way to move the obstacle. She sat with that for a while, too. What happens to Reese, she said. Accessory to manslaughter at minimum. Probably more depending on how the judge reads the premeditation question. He paused. He'll do time. And Crow. Fraud counts are solid. The survey concealment, the debt manipulation, the payments to Price. The manslaughter connection through Reese is strong enough that the district attorney is confident. He looked at her. He'll go to prison, Mrs. Mercer. I can't tell you for how long until a judge decides. But he'll go. She nodded. There was a version of herself she'd imagined, back in the first weeks of all this, that would feel something large and satisfying at this point. Something that felt like the scales balancing, the account settling. What she actually felt was smaller and more complicated than that. Relief, yes, but also the specific grief of understanding that Crow going to prison did not bring Thomas back and was not designed to, that justice and restoration were different things, and the law could deliver one of them. Thomas was still gone. $40 and a man named Reese and a collapsed shaft, and Thomas was still gone. And that was the specific weight she was going to carry for the rest of her life, regardless of what happened to Silas Crow. She knew that. She'd known it. She let herself know it fully, sitting on that bench in October with the first cold of the season in the air and the mountains above the town beginning to show snow on the high peaks. Then she stood up and went back to work. The trial was in January in Leadville, which had a federal courthouse and a judge named Arlen Marsh, who had the reputation of being difficult to impress and impossible to intimidate, both of which qualities seemed appropriate to the occasion. Crow arrived with 2 lawyers from Denver, which was his right, and they were competent men who did what competent defense lawyers do. They challenged the chain of evidence. They questioned Fitch's credibility as a cooperative witness. They argued that the survey commission was legal business activity and that the connection between Crow and Reese was insufficiently established by the paper trail alone. Reese testified in person. He sat in the witness chair and answered questions in the flat, careful voice of someone who has decided to tell the truth completely and accept what follows. And what he said was detailed and specific and included details about a conversation with a man who had not given his name but had given him a description of the timber positions in the number 4 that would only have been available from someone with access to the mine's structural plans, plans that were in the possession of the equipment company, which was Crow's company, which Crow controlled. Tom Ashby testified about the timber he'd examined. He was better on the stand than Lydia had expected. Solid, clear, no hedging. The kind of testimony that came from a man who was saying exactly what he'd seen and had nothing to add to it and nothing to take away. Park testified for an afternoon about the financial documents, and watching him work through the numbers with the judge was like watching someone operate a very precise instrument, methodical, unshowy, devastating in the cumulative effect. Lydia testified on the 3rd day. She told what she knew in the order she'd learned it, starting with the 13 cents and ending with the mountain pass. And she answered the defense lawyer's questions in the same level voice she'd used on Main Street in August, because that voice was the one that cost her the most to maintain, and was therefore the one she trusted most. She did not cry on the stand. She had done her crying in private, the way she did most things that mattered. Crow was convicted on 4 counts of fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit manslaughter. The judge sentenced him to 14 years in the federal penitentiary at Cannon City. Price received 3 years for accepting payments in exchange for a falsified inspection report. Reese received 7 years, reduced from 10 in acknowledgement of his cooperation. Fitch received a fine and a suspended sentence and the permanent revocation of his law license, which Lydia thought was probably the punishment that suited him most precisely. A man for whom his professional identity was everything, losing the thing that told him who he was. She was not in the courtroom when the sentences were read. She'd been there for the verdict, had heard guilty 4 times, and then once more. And then she had walked out into the January cold of Leadville and stood on the courthouse steps and breathed the thin, high-altitude air and looked at the mountains that were visible from everywhere in this part of Colorado, constant and unmoved by the proceedings of men. And she had stood there until Ronan came out behind her and stood beside her without touching her and said nothing. After a while, she said, "It doesn't feel the way I thought it would." "No," he said. "I thought it would feel more like—" She searched for the word. "Like something was fixed," he said. "Yes." "Nothing that got broke got fixed today," he said. "What happened today is that somebody got held to account for breaking it. That's different." She looked at him. He was looking at the mountains. "Is that enough?" she said. He thought about it honestly, which she'd come to expect from him, and had come to value more than she could have anticipated. "I think it's what's available," he said. "Whether it's enough depends on what you do next." She thought about that for a moment, and then she almost smiled, which was the closest she'd come to smiling in 4 months, and felt strange on her face, the way things feel when muscles haven't been used in a while. "I have an idea about what to do next," she said. She'd been thinking about it since October, since the morning she'd sat on the bench outside Coburn's office and understood the difference between justice and restoration. The silver deposit was hers now, confirmed by the federal land examination, the claim clear and undisputed, the assay values from the private survey verified by Park's team and found to be, if anything, conservative. The potential value of the Mercer claim, properly worked with proper equipment and proper expertise, was a number that still felt unreal when she looked at it written down. She didn't need all of it. She'd worked it out with Garrett, who turned out to be more genuinely useful now that he wasn't operating in Crow's shadow, and with a mining engineer named Stills, who came out from Denver in November and spent 3 days examining the deposit and came back with projections that made him visibly excited in the controlled way of men who consider visible excitement unprofessional. She'd worked it out, and she'd thought about it, and she'd talked to a few people. Jim Colby, Eleanor Voss, Pete Delacroix. And by the time January came, she knew what she was going to do. She called it a cooperative. The word was new enough in 1884 that she had to explain it to most people she told, which she did in the plain, specific language she'd decided was the only language worth using for things that mattered. The mine would be worked. It would be worked properly, with engineers and equipment and safety standards that would have prevented what happened to Thomas, which meant spending money before making money, which meant she needed investors, and the investors she chose were the widows and miners and families that Crow's operations had harmed. Eleanor Voss put in $200 that she'd been keeping in a strongbox since August's death. Pete Delacroix put in the cash value of 3 cattle he sold specifically for the purpose, which was enough to make her throat tight when he handed it to her. Jim Colby put in $50 and his expertise in land documentation, which turned out to be worth more than the $50. Tom Ashby put in nothing in cash because he didn't have it, but he committed to building the mine infrastructure at cost, which was a contribution that turned out to be quietly enormous. 14 families invested, some of them a little, some of them more than they could really afford, all of them people who had been living in the shape that Crow's decade in the valley had imposed on them and were now, carefully and with full awareness of the risk, choosing a different shape. Ronan put in nothing in cash either. He'd never had much cash and had never needed much. What he put in was harder to quantify. He spent the winter running survey lines with the mining engineer using the terrain knowledge he'd spent 7 years accumulating, and he built a road up to the mine entrance that cut 3 hours off the supply run. And he was present in the various meetings and negotiations and moments of crisis in the way that a person is present when they've decided something matters enough to show up for it consistently. She noticed this. She noticed most things about him by now with the specific attention that comes from having been through something hard together and come out knowing someone's quality. They didn't talk about it directly. This was partly her and partly him, and partly the specific difficulty of two people who have both learned to carry things alone, figuring out how to be something different. It was not a quick process. It was not a smooth process. There were conversations that went sideways, and silences that lasted longer than they should have, and at least one argument, in March, about the road alignment that was not actually about the road alignment, that ended with both of them sitting on opposite sides of the claim house she'd built at the mine site, and not speaking for a while and then starting over. What they were was two people who had found, against both their expectations, that the world was less manageable alone than it was with the specific other person in question. That was not romantic language. It was accurate language, which she trusted more. In April, when the first real work on the mine was beginning, when Stills had his crew down there and the new support structures were going in, designed with the care that the number 4 had never been given, signed off by Stills and checked by 2 other engineers because she had insisted, she asked Ronan to stay. Not in those words exactly. She said, "You've been sleeping in that cabin for 7 years and the roof needs replacing." He looked at her across the fire they'd built outside the claim house, where they'd both been sitting after a long day, and said, "The roof's fine." "The east corner's gone soft," she said. "I know about the east corner." "You could fix it," she said, "or you could not go back to it." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the fire. "That's a significant thing you're saying." "I know it is." She held his gaze. "I'm not good at this. I was with Thomas for 6 years and I still wasn't good at it. I hold things too close and I'm impatient when people aren't direct with me, and I work too long without stopping." "I know all that," he said. "And I'm telling you anyway," she said, "which should tell you something." He looked at her for a long time in the firelight. This man who had stood in the corner of a store and refused to look away, who had shown up at her door with salt pork and a dangerous theory, who had ridden through a mountain pass in the dark and sat at a federal marshal's desk and watched her stand alone in the center of Main Street without interfering because she'd asked him not to. "I'll look at the east corner," he said, which was enough, which was, between the two of them, exactly enough. The first silver shipment came out of the Mercer Cooperative Mine on a Thursday morning in May, loaded onto 2 wagons with Stills supervising and Tom Ashby checking the equipment with the professional scrutiny of a man who would never again sign off on something structural without being certain it would hold. Lydia watched it from the entrance to the mine shaft, where she'd been standing since early that morning. The ore came up in the skip car and was loaded into the wagons, and the men moved around it doing the particular work of men who have a job to do and are doing it, and the morning was already hot, the summer coming back around the way summers do. Without apology, Ronan came and stood beside her. He smelled like sawdust. He'd been doing something with the mine office construction since 6. And he looked at the wagons with an expression she recognized as satisfaction, the real kind, the kind that came from a thing being done that was worth doing. She looked at the mine entrance. This hole in the mountain that her husband had worked and believed in and died in, that Crow had schemed for 8 years to take, that had cost more than it should have cost to get to this Thursday morning in May. She'd thought about Thomas every day of the last 9 months, and she'd thought about him this morning, and she would keep thinking about him, probably for the rest of her life, the way you keep thinking about the people who shape the trajectory of who you became, even after the trajectory continues past them. She thought about him now, watching the first wagons pull away from the mine, the way he'd talked in the evenings about what the claim might become, those elaborate plans for a proper house with glass windows. He hadn't been wrong about the possibility, just wrong about who would finally dig it out. She felt the grief of that, and she didn't push it away. She'd stopped pushing it away sometime in October, had decided that carrying it and functioning were not mutually exclusive, that the loss and the forward motion could occupy the same body at the same time, which was not a comfortable truth, but it was a true one. What she'd built here was not what she'd imagined 6 months ago. 6 months ago, she'd been running on anger and necessity and had not thought much beyond the next step, and the next step after that. What had accumulated from all those next steps was something she hadn't planned but recognized as right, a mine that employed 23 people, 14 of whom had bought into it, all of whom had agreed to a profit-sharing arrangement that Garrett had written up in clean legal language that Lydia had read 4 times to make sure it said what she meant. A structure that distributed rather than concentrated, that had been designed from the beginning with the specific lesson of Crow's decade in mind. The danger was not wealth. It was the combination of wealth and no accountability to anyone. She was not naive about it. She knew the cooperative would have problems she hadn't anticipated, that the people in it would disagree and make mistakes, and sometimes act out of self-interest rather than collective good, because people do that. She knew that what she'd built was not a solution to the larger question of how power worked in places like this. It was one specific attempt, in one specific valley, to build something that worked differently. Whether it lasted and whether it grew and whether it meant something beyond its own borders was not something she could control. She could control whether it was honest, whether the books were kept clearly and the profits distributed as agreed, and the mine was operated with the care that the people working in it deserved, whether the decisions were made in rooms where the affected people could speak. That was what she could control, and she intended to. Jim Colby had become the cooperative's bookkeeper, which used his actual skills in a context where they served the people rather than the machinery of Crow's operation. And he was good at it in a way that seemed to give him something back, some self-regard he'd lost in the years of processing documents he'd known weren't right. Martha had said privately to Lydia that he was sleeping better. Lydia understood that specifically. Eleanor Voss had started a small fund from her share of the first quarter's profits, money for widows and families who had immediate needs and nowhere to turn. It was not yet large. It was a beginning, which was what beginnings were. The town was not healed. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own mind. Healing was a word that implied a return to a prior state, and the prior state of Caldwell Creek had been a place where one man controlled the conditions of everyone else's survival through the patient accumulation of leverage, and nobody wanted to return to that. What was happening was different, not healing but rebuilding, which was harder because you were building something that hadn't existed before rather than restoring something that had, and you didn't have a blueprint. But Caldwell Creek looked different on a Thursday morning in May than it had looked the previous August. Not dramatically different, not the way places look in stories where justice transforms everything overnight. Differently in the way that places look when the pressure that had been sitting on them lifts. A slight easing, a slight opening, the way air tastes different after a storm has passed, and the sky is not entirely clear yet, but the worst of it is done. She stood at the mine entrance and watched the wagons until they were out of sight down the road. Around her, the men who'd been loading went back to their various tasks, and the mountain morning did what mountain mornings do. It got warmer, the light shifted. A hawk moved in the updraft above the eastern ridge. "What are you thinking?" Ronan said. She thought about it for a moment. What she was thinking was layered and not entirely sorted, and some of it was grief, and some of it was satisfaction, and some of it was something that didn't have a simple name. The specific feeling of having done the thing that was in front of you to do, and having done it the way you'd meant to, and not knowing what came next, but being, for this specific moment, at rest with that. "I'm thinking Thomas would have wanted more glass windows," she said. Ronan was quiet for a moment, and then said, "We can do windows." And she thought she might have actually laughed at that, a short, real laugh, the kind that surprises you. She looked at the mine entrance one more time. The ore was gone. The wagons were gone. What remained was the opening into the mountain and the work that would come back tomorrow, and the morning air and the man beside her who had refused to look away when it would have been easier and more comfortable to look away, and who was standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him without either of them making a point of it. Nobody gets through this life without losing something that mattered, and most people don't get back anything close to what they lost. What they get, if they're paying attention and willing to keep moving when moving is very hard, is the chance to build something that incorporates the loss without being only about the loss. Something that turns the specific, terrible education of what happened to you into something that is at least useful to other people. Lydia Mercer was 34 years old in May of 1884, and she was not happy in the uncomplicated way that people who have not been through much are sometimes happy. She was something harder to achieve than that. She was present. She was clear about what mattered. She was in motion. She turned away from the mine entrance and started walking down toward the claim house where there was work waiting, and Ronan fell into step beside her the way he'd been falling into step beside her for 9 months. And the mountain morning continued around them without ceremony, and that was enough. That was, in the end, exactly enough.
You think I should go back to try to grab this other big thing?
I think you stay at the ship, get out if it's bad. I'll go back to grab the stuff.
You don't have to say that twice. Well, Ben, you think Ben's fucking dead down there?
Yeah, Ben is definitely dead. And James is also. Alright, I'm gonna go get the stuff. If it's bad, get out. Or if I die. Actually, real quick, I'm gonna drop my flashlight as well.
Oh, good night, Sack. See, well, Sack gave up on me tonight. Sack normally stays up. Sack doesn't love me anymore. W. Sack. Sack, say it ain't so, man. What the hell is even going on anymore, man? Great asset, great asset. Hey, they're not leaving prematurely now, so that's good.
Oh, there's dogs.
Are there? Does he know how the dogs work?
I think Xerty does. He hears them though. The dogs are killing the things.
What the fuck, man?
Chandler shot up. He's screaming.
What a fucking dude! You're not supposed to talk. Those things can only hear.
How the fuck am I supposed to know that?
Come on, Xerty.
Oh my God, Zerty, please clutch.
All he needs to do is sit on that back part.
What is he doing? Ah!
He's dead.
What is he doing? Drop the fucking axle!
Just run.
What are you doing? What are you doing, man? But like, you need to. What the fuck are you doing, man?
Don't get mad at him, bro. I would've done
Bro,
the same.
he
Give me the
fucking
axle.
dropped the axle, got up, went back down, got back up, and dropped back down again, man.
You can't climb when having it. You can't.
Yeah, I know. Ditch the fucking thing.
I didn't know it was last one.
Dude, just assume you're always the last one if you don't hear anyone else.
I'm sorry I let you down, Xerty. That motherfucker came in there and swallowed me whole.
We just lost all of our shit. Ah!
We're fucked. How many days do we have?
2.
We'll be fine.
We can make the money back, but all of our